Christine's going to present today, and it's more of she'll present, but you can ask questions along the way. It'll be more of a discussion point than just a presentation where someone presents and no one speaks, ask questions at the end. So feel free to ask questions, and Christine's going to ask questions too, I think, to us. So I'm going to give it over to Christine. You can share your screen.
Thank you. So I also put in the chat I requested that people take notes in that document. So this is not only a psychology and human behavior SIG meeting, it's also a WPI collective learning meeting. We're joint hosting today. So I have less work to do because I also host that meeting. And I like combining and integrating groups. Okay, so thank you for listening to my presentation today on reference modes, lessons from quantifying intangibles from survey data. My name is Christine Tang, and my co-researchers on this project are Saeed Lingrudi at New Mexico State University and Rafat Zaini, who's a research scientist at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. So our agenda today is, first, I'll ask you a couple questions for you to think about during this presentation. Then I'll talk about the background, the research motivation for this, and using the collective learning meeting CLM model as an example. And I'll explain more about that story. And then I'll talk about what I'm interested in creating. It's called the reference mode development algorithm, ReMoDeAL. Then future work. There's a lot of future work because this is a work in progress. I'm still in the early stages of this. Then at the very end, we can have a more lengthy feedback discussion questions session. But like Pascal said, please feel free to ask questions or make comments at any time. So these are the questions I want you to think about during this presentation. How does one quantify intangibles? And what SD or non-SD literature or examples of quantifying intangibles do you recommend? So the background, how I got started into this research. Well, models require data. And what do you do when you don't have data? We believe that there's a lack of a systematic, scalable, and inexpensive method to gather reference modes, that is, behavior over time graphs or time series data for intangibles. And I've presented two other presentations that are similar to this. And the first one is about the data from a collective learning meeting survey. And that's our acronym for it, but it has a formal name I'll explain later. And then the presentation at the International System Dynamics Conference. And here are the links to this. I had trouble figuring out how to send this to you, so I'll just send the slides to Pascal so you can have all this to reference. No, I saw Jim Hines was in the audience, and I am currently transcribing the lectures from the System Dynamics Foundations course at WPI, and I really liked this segment, and I thought it was relevant to what we're doing today, so I'm just going to read this to you. Jim Linus is talking here, and he says, how do we know that this curve is right? We could get data, but is it worth getting data? Then Jim Hines says, does the data exist? Jim Linus, does the data exist? It may. If it exists, would it be worth it? And the answer probably is, let's make sure it's worth it. It is always good practice in system dynamics, I think, to make your best guesses based on interviews and logic. Test the sensitivity. Does it make sense? Before you go out spending lots of money trying to estimate this relationship to 95% confidence. If it doesn't matter to the dynamic behavior, don't spend the time doing it. It's not worth the effort. So first, make a best guess, then test sensitivity of behavior. If it is sensitive, then you might want to get more data. And this is what Saeed and Rafat did. They first built a model and published it in this conference proceedings. And the title of their paper is To Share or Not to Share, Effect of Peer-to-Peer Mentoring on Dynamics of Graduate Life. They used their own personal experience and had their own reference modes in mind when they built this. And then this is the stock flow diagram of their model. And they're specifically curious about divergence, which is in units of idea. And for the ReMoDeAL reference mode development algorithm that I want to create, I think about what are the units of the intangible, and here they chose idea. And then in order to validate the problem and collect more data on other people's reference modes, they created the graduate students research journey survey in order to obtain information to advance the model. Some of the information, the data they collected, is on the university of people who filled out the survey participants. When they started their programs, the program expected end date, sharing frequency, and others. And they specifically asked, how did divergence change over the course of the program? So I hear some background noise. I'm not sure who that is. Would you please mute? Thank you. So from the survey, they had 201 responses, but there were some spam, and we think survey preview is people testing the survey before it really was launched. And actually there was a glitch in which we also recorded the responses of people who just opened the survey and then closed it. So that's why they're all blanks. They didn't respond to any of the questions. So subtracting for all that, we have 149 somewhat usable responses. And of the 149, I looked at the data and saw that only 34 of them finished the graduate program by the time they took the survey, because we have their program expected end date and we know the timestamp for when they took the survey. So I calculated that, and 63 people are in progress. And then there are 52 people who I'm unsure of because they didn't answer that question. And of the 63 who are in progress, less than 29 of them are within a year of finishing, and then 34 are they still have many years left. So the question is, for people who are trying to elicit reference modes, what is the time horizon? Are you only focused on people in the graduate program who finished their graduate program? What is your problem definition, which your reference mode is supposed to help with? Or if you, for example, you might be interested in why people didn't finish their grad programs, and maybe that it's another avenue of your research. But this is also...
Don't you start out with asking what problems you want to solve, or maybe you discover more, and each one has its own reference mode? Of course, you're looking at a situation, so aren't you defining that?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe redefining it based on what you discover?
Yes.
For people who just joined, please ask questions as she goes along. It's a dialogue as opposed to just a presentation.
Yes, and thank you, Pascal. And Saeed and Rafa and I talked about this. This is a back and forth. You're using survey to gather reference modes to further define your problem and refine your model, and it's an iterative process. But I'm a little unsure of this because it means this might never end. How are you?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't understand this because I thought that your reference mode would relate to a problem.
Mhm.
So if you define problems, you search for reference mode related to that problem, or you look at the variables in the model that you think are important and look at the reference mode relative to those variables. But it all references the problem you want to solve or you're looking at.
Yes. And I was thinking that maybe when you collect the data, you see that there are other problems, and then
Right.
you already have the reference mode for that problem. Then you go
Right.
back. It's this iterative thing.
Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah. Okay.
But at the end of the day, you have to stop at one point if you have a paper to write or a thesis to write and say, these are my problems. These are the most interesting ones. Let's go forward, I think.
Yes. And
I actually use reference modes a bit differently, Pascal. I use them to define the problem. So usually I get a group together and there's a fuzzy, people know what the problem is, but they can't articulate it necessarily. And through, first selecting or listing variables and selecting variables to draw the reference modes, that the reference modes actually are pictures usually of the problem. So there's a gap between what you hope for and what you fear. And if your study is successful, you make the hoped for curves a little bit more likely than they would have been otherwise.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
And since it's at the very beginning of the project, usually we don't go back to create more reference modes. And that's partly because we try to pick enough variables to graph, 6 or so, half a dozen seems to be enough, so that we capture, usually in a given problem, there's only 1 or 2, I don't know if I've ever seen 3 really different reference modes going on. And so if you get those patterns, usually the same structure is causing any other reference mode that has that same pattern.
thank you. And I have another question later about what variables are we supposed to measure, but thank you. So I'll continue on with this example, unless anyone else has more comments or questions.
I do have a quick comment. Is that when this research was started, there was a reference mode, but based on a very small sample. That was a sample of 1. And whenever we presented the model, people related to it, but they think maybe you need to gather more data to confirm that reference mode. So it's kind of what Jim said at the beginning. You use the reference mode to define the problem. So we did that, but for a very small sample, if you will.
Yeah, I talked about how Rafid and Saeed used their own personal experience and for this model. So they had their reference mode in their mind. But okay, thank you, Rafid. I wasn't sure that you were here. I didn't see you before, and I don't see people right now because I have the video panel minimized. So in the survey, they asked, how did divergence change over the course of the program? And divergence is any departure, however small, to explore new ideas different from the original research focus. In the stock flow diagram, it's desired research focus. And you started with, so a solid line goes away from the dotted line. Well, you'll see the graphs later. Then convergence is continually narrowing down or combining your research ideas to reach a research focus. Solid line approaches the dotted line, and they provided 6 graphs that people can select from. So number 1 is minimum or no divergence. So the solid line is right on top of the dotted line. And the second one is divergence convergence, where you can see, time is on the x-axis, divergence is on the y-axis, and you can see that there's divergence, then you're converging back to the dotted line. So a question here is, can the intangible be calculated from other variables? And what variable should we be measuring? Which is what Jim Hines said before, because if you recall, we're looking at divergence, but that is a function of focus ideas and desired ideas. So divergence equals focus ideas minus desired research focus. What variables should we measure? And how far do we have to trace back? Are we also looking at research ideas? I think yes. And we also need information on sharing fraction and such, which is what they looked at specifically for that paper. And I don't know. Jim Hines said 6. And so here we do have maybe all of the stocks, and which auxiliaries should we do? These are questions everyone should be thinking of. I just wanted to
So
say
to summarize, what would you say is a variable you want to look at a behavior over time on? Which of these variables?
For me, I think all of the stocks are important, and divergence.
So I'm lost about the problem. What is the basic problem that this is looking at solving?
So I defer to Rafid on this, since he is the one who originally worked on this model. But from what I understand, they're trying to understand how frequently, how does frequency of sharing affects divergence, and we're trying to get people to finish their PhD programs, and we're assuming convergence means they're finishing their research.
So you want people to be more convergent in their ideas so they complete their research on time.
Yes, and I actually don't want people to focus so much on this specific case example, because I want people to think about their own examples too. That's the purpose of this. It's like reference modes, and defining your problem. But this is an example, and thank you for asking your question. Rafa, do you have anything else to say? No? Okay, I'll just move on. And sorry, I forgot to say that focus ideas, desired research focus, and divergence are all in units of idea. And these are the other 4 examples that they provided for the survey participants to choose from. People could have continuous fluctuations, divergence, convergence, or increasing divergence behavior. And there was a slight mistake in number 3, because the divergence is in terms of ideas, and the line should actually be here, below the troughs of that. Because if it's below that original line, then it would be negative, and that doesn't make sense. So my questions to you are, what are missing from these graphs? What do you think we did not capture here that are normal in reference modes?
Do you want responses?
Yes.
One is labeling the time axis enough to get a sense for how long it takes for each mode to complete.
Thank you.
Or to be certain that the mode is there. So
yes, and that goes back to the time horizon, because people have different times. They are like finish their program. Some people finish very long, or if they're in a master's program, it's just 2 years. And here we didn't have any. And another thing that was missing are the bounds. If we're trying to measure an intangible, should there be a min max? Can the intangible be negative? For example, the opposite of love is hate, but so negative love is hate, but or should that example be 2 variables? I'm not so sure about that. And in our case, divergence is in units of idea, and negative values don't make sense here. You can't have negative ideas in the quantitative sense.
So I think that David Losley and I answered some of these questions, or at least gave answers to some of these questions in the workshop we did, which is in our SIG page, about quantifying variables. And you can have negative values if you choose to, and there's reasons why you might not want to. So so those answers are there about quantifying, which is what these are. And I think typically you quantify, you have a range which you fix.
Yes,
what does 0 mean? Well, 0 is for ratio variables. So 0 for intangibles that are ratio for a ratio scale. 0 has a meaning, and the intervals have a have a meaning. They're the same. So, well, what is this? You say, is this a ratio scale? What does this mean? What's this referring to?
The divergence, or just in general, these are questions I want people to ask when they are going through their process. And yes, I'm taking a lot from what you did.
Okay.
So reference you later
so this
on.
is not just about your problem, but this is about in general.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yes, that's what ReMoDeAL was supposed to be. I haven't gotten there yet because this is still the background, the story of how I got to think about this issue.
Okay.
And so while looking at the data for Rafid and Saeed's survey, I found that there were some inconsistent answers. For example, when people answered, how did divergence change over the course of the program? That's the graphs you saw, versus the question, how close was your final product to your initial research idea, which was the desired? 2 people answered minimum or no divergence for the graph, but then they said their final product was not close at all to their initial research idea. So that is a disconnect between those 2 answers. Then one person said that they have increasing divergence, but their final is completely the same as their initial. That also doesn't make sense. It makes sense if those 2 are switched, no minimum or no divergence, and completely the same. Makes more sense. And when people answered, when did you converge on your topic? Some people said they still did not converge. So that means that their graph should be continuous fluctuations, divergence, or increasing divergence. But one person said they have convergence, but in the other question, they said they still did not converge. And another person said that they diverged and converged, but still did not converge. And I actually think this has to do with the fact that these 2 people did not finish their programs yet. So they're just picking graphs based on what they expect, maybe. And they think convergence is, they will eventually converge when the dotted line, the solid line touches the dotted line. So this goes back to the time horizon and your target audience for these surveys. And while thinking of these inconsistent answers and performing consistency checks, I kept looking at each answer and each person individually. And then Rafid realized that maybe we can construct graphs for each person based on their answers to these specific questions and compare them to the selected graphs, one of the 6 that we showed before. So we're trying to understand, did the survey participant understand the question? And so question 9 was, did you start the program knowing the topic you wanted to research? So that gives us an idea of the initial point. Q9 right here, that's your magnitude for divergence in a sense, but it doesn't map completely. I'll talk more about that later. Then Q13 is when did you converge on your research topic, and that gives you the time frame from when they converge, and it could have been all the way from the beginning if you recall that convergence looks like that. And here I just gave an example of this because I thought this looked nicer than the other ones. And Q11 is how many research ideas did you consider before converging to your final research topic? And that's the maximum for this person, not the maximum for the scale, but for this person's answer.
I wonder if I can give an example, or at least let me ask a question. For my thesis, I had three different topics, and I ended up having to make a general topic to cover all three in the end. When I decided, I guess I had 4 different topics, and then I had to make a general and select 2 of them and have a general topic. So I never converged, but I was in the realm of mathematical physics, which is the title of my thesis. So I wonder if that happens now, that people don't converge, but they just have different things they combine later.
Yes, so we noticed that some people did say they have divergence, but they did finish their program. So yes, I think that's the answer. And that also brings into question the hypothesis. What I said before, we want people to converge. They don't necessarily have to converge in order to finish. Okay. And here, how many points do you need? And we'll talk a little bit more later. I want to finish talking about this. So question 7 is how many years did it take you to graduate? So that's the time. And question 10 is how close was your thesis to your final idea, to your initial idea? And that's the very end. And question 12 was how complementary were your research topics fitting under a common theme? And we consider that to be weights on the other questions. So that is why I put Q12 here. So these questions are combined to create some magnitude of divergence. In our hypothetical example, we didn't actually really quantify because it doesn't map correctly. And that is a limitation. So my first question was how many points or questions do you need? One of the limitations is that we don't have enough points in order to construct continuous fluctuations. We only have 3 points maximum. Some people didn't answer some questions, so we only have 2 points for them, and I can't really construct the graphs if we were to. And there's also this issue of inconsistent measurement, because question 9's answers were, I had a clear idea, I had a relatively clear idea, and so on. But question 11 on research ideas, it's a number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the last question, how close was your thesis or dissertation to your initial ideas? 1 to 5, not close at all to completely the same.
Christine, it's just a question. So if your research topic changes, and then you finish that topic, but it's different from your original, is that divergent or convergent because the 2 lines came together?
So this is all compared to your original research idea. So that would be divergence, but you did finish.
Okay, thanks.
And also time. Yes, Rafit?
I think it is considered convergence because you're done. You kind of found something that you converge to. We did not consider exactly the nature of the idea, but at the very end, that you were able to achieve convergence, because to graduate or to submit something that is closed, there need to be a convergence. But people might argue if there is a classification for if it's the same topic or not, but that's not a convergence. So it really depends on how the definition is, but I think it's a convergence in that case.
Well, I guess if the desired research focus, that specific one changes, so you kind of throw away the original one, then you take the new one as your, okay. So it's like throwing away one model example and using that one. The new one. Okay, I'm going to just continue and think about this later. So, and question 13 was not consistent with question 7, because question 13 was options were during your first year, during your second year, when did you converge? And during the last year, and it also didn't give you options for 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th, but that could happen if people extended. This was somewhat under the assumption that it takes 4 or 5 years for people to finish their programs, but we do have cases where people took longer. And question 7 was how many years did it take you to graduate? And the maximum was 10, but maybe people have more than 10. I'm not sure. It depends on your program and the person, especially if they did part-time work, maybe it extended. Or field research, like people in anthropology, I think might take longer, paleontology, stuff like that. So now going back to the reference mode development algorithm, ReMoDeAL, these are the questions I'm thinking of putting in there for people to think about. Specifically about the survey design and the measurement scale, we need to think about the time horizon. What are the units of the intangible? Can the intangible be calculated from others? What variables should we measure? What are the bounds? These are the ones that are researcher defined. And I also will talk a little bit more about this. Do we care about a normal value, desired, expected? And in the following slide, I'll talk about something that I'm interested in, combining control limits, control charts, and reference modes. And then in this ReMoDeAL, I also want to have what Rafit and Saeed did, have graphs that people can select from. And then we also want to have questions that we can construct a graph from. And I want participants to also be able to draw graphs of their intangible using the questions we asked before from the constructed graph and the selected graph to help guide them to draw one of their own. And this is something I'm also thinking about. How should we order these questions, and does the order matter? Well, I think we should go selected, then constructed, and then have them draw. But I don't know if that will bias their questions.
So
their answers.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
But number 3, can the intangibles be calculated from other variables? Do you mean other tangible variables? Well, sometimes you have proxies for a tangible variable, that you have something that's measurable that's a proxy for an intangible. Is that what you mean there?
Yes.
Okay.
And
so
it can be, actually it's more open-ended. It can also be calculated from other intangibles because, yes.
So by calculated mean expressed in terms of?
Mm-hmm. Like divergence was focus ideas minus desired.
So I think that is not calculated from. I think that's related to. How do you?
There was a debate about this actually in the work in progress presentation I did at the ISDC. I said related, but then I wasn't so sure if I should be using that word. And then I thought maybe I should use the word calculated. So you think I should be using the word related?
Calculated, to me, calculated, well, maybe other people have different meanings for calculated, but it means that something is above something else. In other words, these are the basic ones. Now I'm calculating this based on the fundamental ideas. That's one idea. And the other one I had was that you calculate it because it's intangible and you want to express it in terms of a proxy of tangible stuff that you can actually measure without a survey, or a focus group. So maybe there are two concepts embedded in there in that question or more. But one question I definitely would have was, can I calculate this from tangible variables? If not, what else can I do? Or if I do it, how close is it to what I want? What's the, how valid is it in terms of the different validity measurements? So
using a proxy, as you said.
Using a proxy.
Yes.
Which are, well, in my case, my thinking, tangible stuff, measurable, directly measurable. Not that I'm saying intangibles are measurable. It's just a different kind of way of measuring them than you would by counting, and with a ruler.
We need to think a little bit more on that, but I'm also still early stages of this research, so I'll hope to present more and maybe answer that question in the future.
I think it's good to have lots of examples that this might fit into. Sometimes you look at examples and then generalize from the examples that people have done, as opposed to doing top down, go up, may also go bottom up. Here are my 20 examples that I've seen, and this is how things have been done, or how get an idea of how to do things. So that's another way of doing it, is generalize from examples as well as coming down from general to specific.
And I hope we can all work together to generalize together, because you have a lot more experience than I do, and we can ask better questions and design this algorithm. And I forgot to say that we're open to collaboration, so please email me.
I do want to say that I'm not an expert, which means that I'm still open to lots of different possible ways of doing things as we discover them.
I still have a couple slides, so I want to go through this. So we also need to design consistency checks, such as the selected versus constructed versus drawn. Compare them like I did when I said these are inconsistent, and look at what should correlate or what shouldn't correlate, and if it does, why. Maybe I have to throw away those answers, or the example I had, maybe it's because these people didn't finish, or they didn't interpret the question the same way we expected them to. So my background, my undergrad is in industrial engineering and master's is in manufacturing engineering, but I haven't studied control charts in a long time. But I was just thinking about control charts one day and thinking about reference modes. And I think it'd be very useful for people to have control, or could combine the two. So the center line would be like they're normal. This is what you expect. For example, instead of defect rate, because this was the example I found, maybe our intangible was sadness. And if you're just fluctuating around this, it's not a big deal. But if you go above your control limits or below the control limits, but it's sadness. So if you go above, that's where the problematic behavior is. That's what you're concerned about. and the dynamics you're trying to control. And I think it would be much more valuable if we have something like control limits on our reference modes. And I have not seen that, but I also haven't seen many examples before. And in control charts, you also can see where there's a process change. So you understand there's something else that happened here. But I've seen examples where people say this is where there's a vertical line where something happened at that point, and then the process or the system behavior is slightly different after that because of this intervention. That I've seen those in reference modes before. And for example of sadness, it would be like the opposite of this. We would hope that people's control limits would increase over time, so that they become less sensitive to sad things. And I don't know if any of you have seen something like reference modes with additional information before. When Saeed and I were talking about this, Saeed said he somewhat had something like not control limits, but like a line here to explain that if the normalized moving average of water scarcity is above this red line, above 0, then that's problematic because you have more water scarcity. So my question to you is, if you see any examples of not control charts, reference modes plus additional information like this, please let me know, and I can also somehow incorporate that into the graphs, or not graphs, into ReMoDeAL, because we want to have meaningful reference modes, and we need to incorporate that into the surveys or interviews we have with stakeholders. Yeah. So I am still in the early stages of this work. I'm still going through the annotated bibliography that Pascal mentioned and reading some books about measurement scales. And I also am thinking a little bit more about ratio scales because I attended a presentation by Andreas at the International System Dynamics Conference where he talked about how ratio scales are not feasible in certain cases for latent variables. I need to still review that. He sent me his paper. And my question to you and to Jim Hines was, is it impossible to measure intangibles in ratio scales? Because we're measuring people's perceptions, and from what I've seen and heard people say, that maybe if we're going from strongly agree to disagree and strongly disagree, it's not equidistant from each other. Maybe it's agree is very different from disagree, or maybe they're very close to one another.
I think you need at least an interval scale to be quantitative. You don't need a 0, but you need an interval scale if you're going to have some quantitative, unless it's the Richter scale, but something where intervals matter.
That was the end. I just showed my bibliography very quickly, but Pascal can email you these slides later.
Yeah, I'm gonna email a link to this presentation, to the recording, probably next week, and also slides. And Christine, if you would send me that reference about the Roush reference the reference that talked about ratio scales, I'd like to see that also. Anyone have any questions? Any thoughts?
I was curious if Jim Hines was willing to talk about your experience with ratio scales, because I'm really not sure about this.
So, and sure other people do things differently or similarly, but the reference modes that come out of or are at the beginning are usually hand drawn by participants who have the problem. So I'm a consultant, and I think that they usually think of the scale as at least interval, and maybe ratio with a meaningful 0 point. I think that's what's in their head. I mean, I don't quiz them on that, but they usually think that, something goes way up, that, if it goes down by an equal amount, that those two things kind of balance. And if something goes up by twice, well, I guess that's a ratio scale, twice what, well, it's at least interval. If things go up by the same distance, I think they're thinking that that those two distances are approximately the same. I mean, that the values are approximately that far apart. If I understand, it's been a long time since I've thought about interval and ratio scales, so I may not even be answering your question. Was that responsive?
I'm not really sure. Sorry, I need to think more about this. I'll listen to the recording and ask you questions later.
I guess what I'm saying is the question is, for me, would be what do people have in their mind as they draw these reference modes? And I think that it's more than just good, better, best, or poor. I think it's more than that.
Mm-hmm.
So let me end with two things. First of all, thank you, Christine, for discussing this. And does anyone have any more questions, or do you have any more thoughts? So I recently came across, I noticed Christine was going to talk about ratio scales. So I recently came across something yesterday, in fact, this diagram right here, where choosing the right scale could be a matter of life or death. Fahrenheit scale from 0, we choose a scale from 0 to 100. Fahrenheit scale, well, at 0, you're really cold, or you're really hot at 100. Celsius, well, you're fairly cold outside, or dead if it's 100. And of course, Kelvin, which is the ratio scale, you're not really alive at any point. Okay, so next time, on the 5th, we're going to have Andrea Bloomberg. She's from Latvia, talking about passive aggressiveness, the story of unfulfilled love and suppressed anger. So that should be interesting. She'll have a system dynamics model of that. She gave a presentation at a post session of this at the conference, and now she has the opportunity to speak more about it. So if you're not on my mailing list and you want to be invited to this or other ones, just send me an email.
Kareem said, no, the opposite of love is apathy or indifference. So that my example of hate being the opposite of love is not completely correct. And that's also why I thought it might be 2, because in my mind, it also is not opposite.
Could you say that again? What are you referring to?
Kareem said the opposite of love is apathy or indifference. But in my example of can their intangible be negative, I used love and hate because I saw that example before. It's a Romeo and Juliet example, if I remember correctly.
I think there's more than one possibility for opposites, depending on the meaning you give to the terms.
Then Hamilton said each emotion is unique. Then Rob said, I beg to differ, Kareem. The opposite of love is egoism
So
or
there's
narcissism.
there's a chart which I can share, which is a chart of emotions, basic emotions and emotions that derive from them. So perhaps I can share that when I send the response out. You can take a look. Because I gave a presentation once on emotions and emotions in society. It was Turner wrote a book, Emotions in Society, and it was about what he was referring to and what I came across. So.
I also want to say something related to reference modes and intangibles like happiness and love.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think of this, if I'm trying to draw an intangible, I might be thinking of an event, like, for example, my graduation. I was very happy at that point, and to me, that's my maximum. But this also has to do with time horizon. But if I go farther, maybe in the future, if I ever get married, then that will be my next happiest. So you really have to think of the time horizon and what happens. But is it correct for people to be thinking in terms of events? Because that's not really what we're doing. I'm not sure.
People look at the outside world and come to an emotion. Something in the outside world, whatever it is, event, occurrence, thought. Well, usually there's two types. If you look at something in the world that's actual, you have a primary experience of that, and emotion comes from that. If I'm thinking in my head about something that happened in the past, then I have a secondary feeling. I think of I'm angry that I felt embarrassed then. So it's more complicated. It depends on whether it's a primary thing or in your head thinking about what you felt. That's another level of an emotion.
And if we're asking for their whole past behavior, like I asked them to draw it, then maybe their definitions, their scale is changing.
They might
over time too.
They might be looking at re-experiencing emotion by re-experiencing what they saw, or they might be thinking about it in another. When you were married, you have a different frame of work. Your whole frame of life is different than you were when you were single. So I can tell you, and so you think things differently. So love means different things. I mean, everything means you have children now, so there's lots of things that are different. So when I said primary experience, and then I said there's a secondary experience where you look at that embarrassment or love of something, and you feel calm about it, or some other experience. It's calm love or calm fear of something. It's more of a higher level, but it's also changing the frame. I'm not being direct. Now I'm changing the frame of my experience. If I think, if I'm afraid of something in the world, then I can express that fear, or I can have a sort of another frame and put it of calmness. When I feel fear, if I feel calm fear, that's going to change how I behave and how I think. So I think things are a little more complicated. And I'm not sure how to express that totally yet in the system dynamics model. That it makes any sense.
Yeah, and I translate it in my mind as the reference mode and scale is changing, or maybe the control limits are changing, or I'm not really sure.
Well, what's the purpose
how to think of this?
So in your modeling, what's the purpose of the reference mode? What does it serve in the modeling process? I mean, not that I know I'm saying, what am I looking at? Why do I care?
For me, I think that's what behavior we're trying to model. If your model cannot get that behavior, then
so you're selecting things in the world. I mean, you have this problem. You're selecting things that you think are important to change. And the model is going to tell how these things change. And then you can influence if it's a model for the world, not just a model of learning or other kinds of models. If it's a model for the world, you want to be able to influence it. So you pick those things that are critical, one or two, however, maybe 5 or 6, however many there are. These are things I want to look at. So those are your reference modes. But I think of them in terms of variables that I really want I see that they may impact the problem. They may not. Some you'll find out may not, but some. So I look at them as constructs that you think influence the problem, and you want to see how they change and how you want them to change, or you know how they change and you want them to be different from what's going on. Is that right?
Well, we have a guess as to how they might change, and that's what we need the model for, I guess.
You have a guess of how they might change and how they behave.
Yes.
Yeah. But I'm just saying I'm just trying to nail down what exactly do I care about when I have a reference mode. I don't know, it may seem obvious, but I think sometimes it's worth thinking about.
Pascal, do you want audience participation?
Absolutely. The whole thing is about discussion. I mean, I'm just saying things because I want to keep the conversation going.
Yeah. So I think the reason you do reference modes is for a couple of things, what Christine said. It's also, as I mentioned before, a picture of the problem definition. And so in the process that I do, the reference modes are things that you really care about. So one is the issue itself. So if you're concerned about how long it takes to graduate, that would, well, if it's not done on, it's probably done as Christine or Rafat did on the timeline, but you want the thing itself. So if you're concerned about poverty, you want to draw some curve of poverty. And then you want people to also draw things that they think are important causes of it, direct causes, whether or not you can observe them. And the other thing is, I think Christine referred to about the purpose of reference modes is hope. So the term reference mode, what does that mean, right? Well, mode is an engineering term that means a pattern, pattern and potentially a time series. And reference means that it's something that you refer to all during the project. So it keeps grounding you in the pattern that you're interested in understanding.
That makes sense. That sounds good.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for hosting me, Pascal. There's a lot in the chat. I haven't been able to read it, but I'll save it and read it and respond to people maybe if there are any questions. But I think they're all comments about love and other things, which I think is very nice.
Well, thank you for presenting and being brave enough to talk about what you do, what you want to do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christine. And good to see you, Jim.
Nice to see you, Kareem, and thank you, Christine. Interesting talk.
Christine?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, I think maybe if you swap your the student archetype with something, a little bit more like an extreme archetype, like someone considering suicide, for example, that might help you hash out those reference modes, because the consequences would be more extreme, so it would be easier for you to see what happens if you converge with that idea or you diverge from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I need to think a little bit more about this. And I was just using something that someone else created, but I didn't think about this as in another context before. So this is just new information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.